Ethan Carter stepped out into the golden afternoon sunlight, the quiet suburban streets of Glendale stretching peacefully before him. At his side, Max, his Labrador mix, wagged his tail with a rhythmic thump, his energy as infectious as always. Ethan smiled down at his companion, ruffling the dog's caramel fur before adjusting the leash in his hand. "Ready, boy?" Ethan asked, though the way Max pulled eagerly toward the sidewalk made the question unnecessary. The neighborhood had become a refuge for Ethan in the last year, a world away from the glitz and chaos of Hollywood. His life as an actor had its rewards, but after his last blockbuster, he needed time to recharge, to reconnect with the simpler things in life. Walks with Max had become his favorite part of the day. There was something grounding about the dog's unshakable enthusiasm for the world around him. As they strolled, neighbors called out cheerful greetings. A jogger passing by gave Max a quick pat on the head, while a group of children on bikes waved and giggled as the dog barked happily at them. Ethan soaked it all in, feeling a rare moment of peace. Their destination wasn't far, a cozy cafe with a reputation for welcoming dogs. It had become a regular spot for Ethan and Max, its shaded patio offering a perfect place to relax with a coffee while Max lounged at his feet. When they arrived, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wafted through the air. The cafe's patio was a cheerful scene, with wrought iron tables scattered under string lights and patrons chatting softly over their meals. Ethan spotted an empty table near the edge, where Max could stretch out comfortably, and guided him there. "Ethan," a warm voice called out. He turned to see Mara Jacobs approaching, balancing a tray of drinks. Her apron was dusted with flour, and a streak of whipped cream decorated one sleeve, but her smile was as bright as ever. "Hey, Mara," Ethan said, taking a seat. "Busy day?" "Aren't they all?" she replied with a grin before crouching to scratch Max behind the ears. "And who's my favorite customer?" "Max, of course." Max's tail wagged furiously, and Ethan chuckled. "You're going to spoil him." "That's the goal," Mara teased as she straightened up. "Coffee and your usual?" "Please," Ethan replied. "And maybe a water bowl for him if it's not too much trouble." "Coming right up," she said, heading back inside. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the contented hum of the cafe wash over him. Max rested his head on Ethan's foot, his eyes half closed as he soaked in the warmth of the day. Then came the sound that changed everything, the low, rumbling growl of motorcycles. Ethan looked up, his brows knitting together as a group of bikers roared into the parking lot. Their leather vests and booming laughter disrupted the tranquil atmosphere, and the chatter on the patio grew noticeably quieter. Leading the group was a man Ethan vaguely recognized. Randy Briggs, the kind of guy whose presence always seemed to spell trouble. Randy and his gang sauntered onto the patio, their boots thudding heavily against the pavement. The air seemed to shift, tension replacing the previous calm. Ethan noticed Mara hesitate as she emerged with his coffee, her smile faltering. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked quietly as she set his drink down. "Yeah," Mara said quickly, though her eyes darted toward the bikers. "Just those guys. They've been coming around a lot lately." Ethan gave a slight nod, deciding it was best to stay out of their way. He reached down to stroke Max's fur, but his fingers tensed slightly. The bikers settled at a table in the middle of the patio, their loud voices breaking the relative quiet. Unfortunately, staying out of their way didn't seem to be an option. "Well, well," Randy said loudly, his eyes locking onto Ethan. "If it isn't the big screen star and his little mutt." Ethan glanced up, his expression calm but firm. "We're just here for some coffee, same as you." Randy smirked, leaning against a nearby table. "That's cute. Bet you got that dog just to complete the whole nice guy image, huh?" Ethan ignored him, focusing instead on Max, who remained calm but alert. "Not much of a talker, are you?" Randy sneered. He took a step closer, and before Ethan could react, he raised his boot and kicked Max's side. The yelp that escaped Max was like a dagger to Ethan's heart. The dog scrambled to his feet, his body trembling as he looked to Ethan for reassurance. Ethan shot out of his chair, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. He knelt beside Max, gently running his hands over the dog's body. "You okay, boy?" he murmured. Max licked Ethan's hand, his tail wagging weakly as if to reassure him. Ethan stood, his gaze locking onto Randy. "What's your problem?" he said, his voice low but firm. "My problem?" Randy laughed, his voice loud and mocking. "Just teaching you and your mud a lesson. Don't take it so personally." The patio had gone silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Mara stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "That's enough, Randy," she said. "You've made your point. Leave." Randy held her gaze for a long moment before letting out a derisive snort. "Relax, sweetheart. No harm, no foul." With that, he turned and sauntered back to his gang, who followed him out of the cafe, their laughter echoing long after they'd gone. Mara turned to Ethan, her expression full of concern. "Are you okay? Is Max okay?" "We're fine," Ethan said, though his hands were still trembling. He crouched again, stroking Max's fur. "Right, buddy? You're tough." Max pressed his nose into Ethan's hand, his eyes soft but trusting. Ethan looked around the patio, noting the unease still lingering in the air. This wasn't just about him and Max. People like Randy thrived on intimidation, and unless someone stood up to them, they'd keep spreading fear. As Mara returned to work, Ethan sat quietly with Max, his coffee untouched. The events of the afternoon replayed in his mind, and he made a silent promise. No one would hurt Max or anyone else without facing the consequences. The simple walk had ended, but something far bigger had begun. That evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Ethan Carter sat on the porch of his modest home, Max stretched out beside him. The Labrador mix had shaken off the earlier incident, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden floorboards as he enjoyed the cool evening breeze. Ethan sipped his tea, gazing out at the quiet neighborhood. The streets, lined with trees and warm porch lights, felt like a safe haven. He ran a hand over Max's fur absent-mindedly, grateful that his loyal companion seemed unharmed by Randy Briggs' cruel kick. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you, buddy?" Ethan said softly. Max responded with a quiet huff, his eyes half closed in contentment. It wasn't until later that Ethan noticed something was off. After their usual routine of dinner and a bit of playtime in the yard, Max seemed unusually lethargic. He refused his favorite treat, something Ethan couldn't remember him doing before. "What's the matter, boy?" Ethan crouched down, studying Max. The dog's eyes looked dull, and his breathing seemed shallow. Alarm bells began to ring in Ethan's mind. Max wobbled slightly as he stood, then collapsed onto his side, letting out a low, pained whine. Panic surged through Ethan's chest. "Max!" he exclaimed, gently cradling the dog's head. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he needed to act fast. Ethan grabbed his phone and called the nearest emergency veterinary clinic. "My dog, he's sick. He just collapsed," he told the receptionist, his voice shaking. The calm, professional tone on the other end of the line guided him. "Bring him in right away," the receptionist said. "We'll be ready for you." Ethan carefully scooped Max into his arms. The dog's weight was substantial, but adrenaline gave Ethan the strength to carry him to his car. He placed Max gently on the back seat, securing him with a blanket before speeding off into the night. The veterinary clinic was a small, brightly lit building tucked between a pharmacy and a bank. Ethan burst through the doors, Max cradled in his arms. "Help, please." Ethan's voice cracked with urgency. A woman in scrubs hurried over, her name tag reading Dr. Angela Morris. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Ethan's panic. "Bring him back here," she said, leading him to an exam room. Ethan laid Max on the metal examination table, stepping back as Dr. Morris and her assistant went to work. The dog barely moved, his breaths shallow and labored. "What happened?" Dr. Morris asked as she checked Max's vitals. Ethan explained the events of the day, his words spilling out in a rush. "He was fine earlier, but then he just collapsed. Do you think it could be from that biker who kicked him?" Dr. Morris frowned. "It's possible, but it sounds like something more. Was he left unsupervised at all? Could he have gotten into anything?" Ethan's mind raced. "He was in the yard for a little while. I didn't see him get into anything, but..." He stopped, his gut tightening with realization. There was a sausage in the yard earlier. I didn't think much of it, but could it have been poisoned? Dr. Morris's expression grew grave. We'll need to act quickly. The next hour was a blur. Dr. Morris administered activated charcoal to absorb any toxins that might still be in Max's system. They started 4 fluids to stabilize him and took blood samples to determine what, if anything, had been ingested. Ethan paced the waiting room, his hands clenched into fists. The memory of Randy Briggs' sneering face flashed through his mind. Could he have done this? It felt too cruel, even for someone like him, but Ethan couldn't ignore the timing, or the possibility. Dr. Morris emerged from the exam room, her expression tired but steady. Mr. Carter, we've stabilized Max for now, but the blood work confirms our suspicions. He was poisoned with a combination of narcotics and a toxic substance commonly found in rodent poison. Ethan's stomach churned. Is he going to be okay? Dr. Morris nodded, though her tone was cautious. We acted quickly, which gives him a strong chance. But he's not out of the woods yet. We'll need to keep him here overnight for observation and further treatment. Ethan swallowed hard, guilt and anger warring within him. Who would do something like this? Dr. Morris placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes compassionate. Unfortunately, there are cruel people out there. The important thing is that you got him here in time. After signing the necessary paperwork and leaving his contact information, Ethan stepped out into the cool night air. The weight of the evening pressed heavily on him as he got into his car. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the events of the day. Randy's mocking face, the biker's laughter, and now this deliberate attack on Max. It all connected too neatly to be a coincidence. Ethan made a silent vow as he drove home. He wouldn't let this go. Max was more than just a pet. He was family. Whoever had done this would face justice, not just for Max, but for anyone else who might become their next victim. As Ethan parked in his driveway, he noticed something on his front porch. A piece of paper, held down by a small rock, fluttered slightly in the breeze. He approached cautiously, his pulse quickening as he picked it up. The note was scrawled in messy handwriting. Back off, or next time it won't just be your dog. Ethan's grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. The message confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a warning. Ethan Carter woke to a restless morning, his thoughts tangled in the events of the night before. Max's poisoned condition and the threatening note left on his porch had shattered his sense of peace. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into his coffee cup. The usually comforting aroma seemed muted, overpowered by the anxiety gnawing at his chest. Max was still at the veterinary clinic, fighting to recover under Dr. Morris's watchful care. Ethan had spoken to her earlier, and while Max was stable, the vet warned him that the dog would need close monitoring for several days. The note weighed heavily on him. Someone wanted to scare him into silence, but Ethan wasn't the type to back down. Whoever had done this wasn't just a danger to him and Max. They posed a threat to the entire community. He slipped the note into an envelope and grabbed his keys. His first stop would be the local police station. At the station, Officer Daniel Reyes greeted Ethan with a firm handshake and a calm, measured demeanor. A veteran officer with years of experience in community policing, Reyes was known for his dedication to protecting Glendale's quieter streets from the encroaching influence of nearby gangs. "What brings you in today, Mr. Carter?" Reyes asked as they settled into a small interview room. Ethan handed over the note, recounting everything that had happened: the incident at the cafe, Max's sudden illness, and the poisoned sausage. Reyes listened intently, his brow furrowing as he examined the note. "This is serious," Reyes said, his voice low. "It's not just a threat. It's intimidation, likely tied to something bigger." "Do you think it could be Randy Briggs?" Ethan asked, his anger barely contained. Reyes leaned back in his chair, considering. "Briggs has a reputation. He's been on our radar for months, tied to a group involved in low-level crimes, mostly intimidation and petty theft, but nothing we've been able to pin down. If he's escalated to poisoning animals and leaving threats, it's a dangerous development." "What do we do?" Ethan asked. Reyes placed the note into a clear evidence bag. "First, we'll analyze this for fingerprints or DNA. Second, I'll file an official report and escalate it to our investigations unit. In the meantime, I'd suggest you stay vigilant. Don't confront Briggs or his group directly. Let us handle it. Ethan nodded, though his frustration lingered. He didn't want to sit idly by while the people responsible for hurting Max walked free. Determined to gather more information, Ethan decided to revisit the cafe and speak with Mara. He needed to know if anyone else had noticed Randy's behavior or connections that might shed light on the situation. The cafe was bustling when Ethan arrived, the morning rush in full swing. Mara spotted him immediately, her expression shifting to one of concern as she walked over. "Ethan, how's Max?" she asked, her voice soft. "He's stable, but it was close," Ethan said. "Mara, I need your help. Did you notice anything unusual yesterday with Randy or his group?" Mara hesitated, glancing around before gesturing for him to follow her to a quieter corner. "Randy's been coming here for weeks," she said in a hushed tone. "He's always been a jerk, but lately he's been different, more aggressive." "Different how?" "He's been meeting with people I don't recognize, rough-looking types. They don't order anything. They just talk for a few minutes and leave. It's been making everyone nervous." "Did you see them yesterday?" Ethan pressed. Mara nodded. "There was a guy in a black hoodie sitting near the edge of the patio. He left right before Randy did." "Could you describe him?" "Not really. He kept his hood up, but I did notice he had a scar on his left hand when he paid his bill." Ethan thanked her, his mind racing as he pieced together the details. The scarred man might be a lead, but it wasn't enough to act on. He needed more. His next stop was the local hardware store, where a friend had mentioned that Randy and his group often hung around the parking lot. Ethan hoped someone there might have seen something. The manager, an older man named Hal, greeted Ethan warmly. "Haven't seen you here in a while, Ethan. How's that dog of yours?" "He's recovering," Ethan said carefully. "Hal, I need to ask you something. Have you noticed Randy Briggs or his friends around here recently?" Hal's face darkened. "Yeah, those troublemakers have been hanging around. They loiter in the lot, scare off customers. I've called the cops a few times, but they're gone before anyone shows up." "Have they been meeting anyone new? Someone in a black hoodie, maybe with a scar on his hand?" Hal thought for a moment before nodding. "I've seen a guy like that a couple of times. Looks shady. He usually hands something off to Randy. Could be cash, could be something else. Always quick." Ethan thanked Hal, the picture becoming clearer. Randy wasn't just a bully. He was likely involved in something criminal, maybe even dealing illegal substances. That evening, Ethan sat in his living room, sifting through the information he'd gathered. The evidence was circumstantial, but it pointed to a troubling escalation in Randy's behavior. The note, Max's poisoning, and the reports of suspicious activity all connected back to the same source. Ethan knew he needed to tread carefully. While he trusted Officer Reyes, he also understood that the wheels of justice turned slowly. In the meantime, Randy was still out there, a threat to the neighborhood and anyone who crossed him. Ethan glanced at the empty spot where Max's bed usually sat, his chest tightening. His dog was fighting for his life because of someone else's cruelty. He couldn't let that stand. With a deep breath, Ethan picked up his phone and began calling a few trusted friends, including local animal rights advocates and community leaders. If Randy Briggs thought he could intimidate Ethan into silence, he was about to learn otherwise. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the suburban streets as Ethan Carter pulled into the small parking lot outside Mara's cafe. The normally bustling spot was quieter than usual, the recent tension surrounding Randy Briggs and his gang casting a shadow over the community. Inside, Ethan found Mara behind the counter, organizing stacks of menus. She looked up as he entered, offering a tired smile. "Back again so soon?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, leaning against the counter. "I need your help. It's time we do something about Randy and his gang." Mara's expression shifted to one of cautious curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" "I've been talking to some people," Ethan explained. "Animal rights advocates, neighbors, even a few local business owners. Everyone's tired of the way Randy and his group operate. We need to stand together." Mara tilted her head. "What are you thinking? A protest? Petitions?" "Both," Ethan said. "But more than that. We need to show Randy that we won't be bullied. If we create enough public pressure, It might even push law enforcement to act faster. Mara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Count me in. And I know a few others who'd jump on board, too. Over the next few days, Ethan and Mara worked tirelessly to rally the community. Flyers were distributed, social media posts went viral, and local activists joined the effort. The campaign focused on safety, animal rights, and standing up against intimidation. By the weekend, a small but determined crowd had gathered outside Randy's usual hangout, a grungy bar called the Steel Stallion. The air was charged with a mix of nervous energy and quiet resolve. Ethan stood at the front of the group, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Max. No more cruelty." Beside him, Mara held a similar sign, her face set with determination. As the protest began, chants filled the air. "Justice for Max. Protect our community." Passers-by stopped to watch, some joining in while others recorded the scene on their phones. The attention drew Randy and his gang out of the bar, their presence immediately darkening the atmosphere. Randy sauntered toward the protesters, a sneer plastered across his face. His gang followed closely, their heavy boots echoing ominously on the pavement. "Well, look at this," Randy said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A little parade for your precious mutt. How cute." Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. "This isn't just about Max. It's about you, Randy. You've been terrorizing this neighborhood long enough." Randy's sneer turned into a scowl. "Careful, Carter. You don't want to start something you can't finish." "I'm not starting anything," Ethan replied calmly. "I'm standing up for what's right." The crowd behind Ethan grew louder, their chants swelling in support. Randy's face twisted in anger, but he seemed to realize that the sheer number of witnesses worked against him. He raised his hands mockingly, stepping back. "Fine," he said. "Have your little protest. But don't think this changes anything." He turned and walked back into the bar, his gang following reluctantly. After the protest, Ethan and Mara gathered with a few others at the cafe to debrief. The event had been a success, drawing attention to Randy's behavior and rallying the community in a way Ethan hadn't seen before. "That was incredible," Mara said, her eyes shining. "People are finally taking notice." Ethan nodded, though a lingering unease settled in his chest. He knew Randy wouldn't take this lying down. Sure enough, that night, Ethan found another note on his porch. This one was more direct. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Ethan stared at the note, anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He took a photo of it and sent it to Officer Reyes, along with a message, "He's escalating. We need to act." Reyes responded quickly, "Understood. We're building a case. Stay vigilant." The following day, Ethan met with community leaders and local officials to discuss the next steps. Among them was Lisa Benton, a passionate animal rights advocate who had been instrumental in organizing the protest. "Public pressure is working," Lisa said, "but we need to keep the momentum going." "What's the status on the police investigation?" Ethan relayed Reyes's update, though he wished the process were moving faster. "They're gathering evidence, but it takes time. In the meantime, we can't let up." The group brainstormed ideas, from organizing more protests to creating an online petition demanding action against Randy's gang. They also discussed ways to support local businesses that had been targeted, ensuring they didn't feel isolated. As the days passed, the community effort gained traction. News outlets picked up the story, focusing on Max's poisoning and the broader issue of intimidation in Glendale. Ethan found himself at the center of it all, both as a victim seeking justice and as a voice for change. But with each victory came a growing sense of danger. Randy's gang began making their presence known in subtle but chilling ways. A motorcycle revving outside Ethan's house late at night, intimidating stares during his walks, and whispered threats from unknown callers. Ethan knew he was walking a fine line, but every time he looked at Max, now recovering steadily at the veterinary clinic, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. And Ethan wasn't backing down. Ethan Carter sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched before him. The house felt eerily quiet without Max. Though the dog's condition had stabilized at the clinic, the absence of his loyal companion weighed heavily on Ethan. He was grateful for Dr. Morris's updates, But until Max was home, the unease in his chest wouldn't subside. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The caller ID displayed Officer Reyes. Ethan picked up immediately. "Ethan," Reyes said, his tone professional but urgent. "We've got a break." Surveillance footage from a hardware store parking lot shows Randy Briggs meeting with someone who matches the description of the man you mentioned, the guy with the scar on his hand. "What were they doing?" Ethan asked, leaning forward in his chair. "They exchanged something, likely cash for goods. The footage isn't clear enough to identify what, but it's enough to add suspicion to Briggs's activities. And there's more. We found traces of the same poison used on Max in a nearby alley where Briggs and his gang often hang out." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "What does this mean?" "It means we're building a case," Reyes said. "But we need more. My team is preparing a warrant to search Briggs's usual spots. If there's anything tying him to illegal activity, we'll find it." Ethan exhaled, a mix of relief and frustration coursing through him. "How long will that take?" "Not long," Reyes assured him. "In the meantime, stay on guard. These types don't back down easily." That afternoon, Ethan decided to visit the veterinary clinic. Max had been responding well to treatment, and Ethan needed the comfort of seeing his dog. When he arrived, Dr. Morris greeted him with a tired but reassuring smile. "Max is doing well," she said as she led Ethan to the recovery area. "He's been eating and responding to the medication. If this progress continues, you'll be able to take him home soon." Ethan's heart lifted as he saw Max resting on a soft bed, his tail thumping weakly at the sight of his owner. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside him. He ran a hand over Max's fur, noting the warmth and strength returning to his once lifeless body. "You're tougher than I am, you know that?" Dr. Morris chuckled. "He's a fighter, but he'll need a lot of care when he gets home. Keep him calm and follow the medication schedule I'll give you." Ethan nodded, absorbing the instructions. "Thank you for everything, Doctor. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You did your part by getting him here in time," she said. "Now let's make sure he gets back to full health." As Ethan left the clinic, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Mara. "Ethan," she said, her voice edged with worry. "You need to get down to the cafe. Randy's back, and he's causing trouble." Ethan's stomach dropped. "I'm on my way." He arrived at the cafe to find a tense scene. Randy and two of his gang members loomed near the entrance, their presence an unmistakable threat. Mara stood at the counter inside, her face pale but determined. Ethan pushed through the door, his eyes locking onto Randy. "What are you doing here?" Randy smirked, leaning casually against the counter. "Just grabbing a coffee. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime." "You don't fool anyone," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "You're here to intimidate, and it's not going to work." The smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Stirring up trouble, getting people all riled up. Maybe it's time someone put you in your place." Ethan stood his ground, the tension thick enough to cut. Behind him, other patrons had begun quietly leaving, sensing the brewing confrontation. "Leave Randy," Ethan said firmly. "Now." Randy's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Officer Reyes and two other officers entered the cafe, their presence a welcome sight. "Randy Briggs," Reyes said, his tone authoritative. "We need to have a word outside." Randy's bravado faltered as he glanced between Ethan and the officers. "This isn't over," he growled before following Reyes out the door. After the gang left, the cafe slowly returned to normal. Mara approached Ethan, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." "They won't get away with this," Ethan said. "The police are closing in. We just need to stay strong." Mara nodded, though her worry lingered. Later that night, Ethan sat on his porch, his thoughts racing. Randy's escalation, the poison, the threats. It was all part of a larger pattern. But Reyes's update gave him hope. The case against Randy was growing stronger, and with luck, justice would soon follow. For now, Ethan focused on one thought. Max would be coming home soon. And when he did, Ethan would ensure no one ever hurt him, or anyone else again. The next morning, Ethan Carter received a text message from Officer Reyes. Search warrant approved. We're moving in on Randy's hideout today. Stay alert and don't engage. Ethan stared at the message, his thoughts racing. Reyes's words were clear, but staying out of it was easier said than done. Randy's actions had already brought harm to Max, and Ethan's instincts told him the confrontation would escalate before the day was over. That afternoon, Ethan went to the cafe to check on Mara and the other employees. He found her restocking shelves behind the counter, her demeanor tense but focused. "You okay?" Ethan asked, leaning against the counter. Mara nodded, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "As okay as I can be, knowing those guys are still out there." "They won't be for long," Ethan said, trying to reassure her. "The police are closing in." Before Mara could respond, the sound of engines roaring outside made both of them freeze. Ethan turned to see a familiar group of motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. Randy and 4 of his gang members dismounted, their presence radiating menace. They moved toward the cafe with purpose, their heavy boots striking the pavement like a warning. Ethan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He glanced at Mara, who was already reaching for her phone. "Call the police," he said. "I'll handle this." The gang entered the cafe, their swagger filling the space like a dark cloud. Randy's smirk widened as he spotted Ethan. "Well, if it isn't the hero," Randy drawled. "We were just talking about you." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between the gang and the rest of the cafe. "You're not welcome here, Randy. Leave." Randy chuckled, his gang joining in. "You really think you can tell us what to do? This is our town, Carter, not yours." The tension in the room was palpable. Other patrons hurriedly exited, leaving Ethan and Mara standing alone against the gang. "You think intimidation makes you powerful?" Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "It doesn't. It just shows how weak you are." Randy's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, dangerous glare. "Careful, Carter. You don't know who you're messing with." Ethan squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a coward who poisons animals and hides behind his gang." The words hit their mark. Randy lunged forward, shoving Ethan back. The impact sent a chair skidding across the floor, but Ethan caught his balance quickly. "Get out!" Mara shouted from behind the counter, her voice trembling but firm. Before Randy could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows as police cars screeched to a stop outside. Officer Reyes was the first through the door, his gun drawn. "Randy Briggs, step away and put your hands where I can see them." Randy froze, his bravado slipping as Reyes and his team entered the cafe. His gang hesitated, their confidence wavering under the weight of the police presence. "This isn't over," Randy snarled, his gaze flicking to Ethan. "Yes, it is," Reyes said, stepping forward. He handcuffed Randy as the other officers secured the rest of the gang. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over him as the gang was escorted out. Reyes turned to him, his expression both stern and concerned. "I told you not to engage," Reyes said. "They came here," Ethan replied. "I couldn't just stand by." Reyes sighed but nodded. "You did what you had to, but next time, let us handle it." This could have gone south fast. Outside the cafe, the police conducted a thorough search of Randy's motorcycles and the nearby area. To Ethan's grim satisfaction, they uncovered several items that tied Randy to the poisoning incident, including a stash of the same toxic substance used on Max. Reyes approached Ethan a short while later. "We've got enough to charge him with animal cruelty, intimidation, and illegal possession of hazardous materials. This should stick." Ethan nodded, though the victory felt bittersweet. "I just want him to pay for what he did." "He will," Reyes assured him. "And thanks to your help, we've got a strong case. You stood up when others were too scared to, and that matters." That evening, Ethan returned home to a quiet house. The adrenaline from the day had left him drained, but the knowledge that Randy was finally behind bars gave him a sense of closure. The phone rang, and Ethan picked it up to hear Dr. Morris on the other end. "Good news," she said. "Max is ready to come home tomorrow. He's made a remarkable recovery." Ethan smiled for the first time in what felt like days. "Thank you, doctor." That's the best news I've heard all week. As he hung up, Ethan looked at the empty spot where Max's bed usually sat. Tomorrow, it wouldn't be empty anymore. Ethan leaned back on the couch, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting. Justice had been served, and soon, Max would be home where he belonged. For now, that was enough. The sun rose over Glendale, bathing the streets in a soft, golden light. Ethan Carter stood outside the veterinary clinic, his heart pounding with anticipation. Today, Max was coming home. The door opened, and Dr. Angela Morris stepped out with a warm smile. Behind her trotted Max, his tail wagging and his caramel fur gleaming. Though still a bit thinner than usual, Max's energy was unmistakable. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, dropping to his knees as Max bounded toward him. The dog let out an excited bark, licking Ethan's face with pure joy. "He's officially in the clear," Dr. Morris said. "But remember, he'll need plenty of rest and a strict medication schedule for the next few weeks." "I've got it all covered," Ethan assured her, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Dr. Morris nodded. "You gave him the chance to fight by acting quickly. He's lucky to have you." Ethan looked down at Max, stroking his fur. "I think I'm the lucky one." Later that day, Ethan received a call from Officer Reyes. Randy Briggs and his gang had been formally charged with a list of offenses, including animal cruelty, intimidation, and the illegal possession of toxic substances. The arraignment was scheduled for the following morning. "Are you ready to testify?" Reyes asked. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Max, who was dozing peacefully by his side. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they don't hurt anyone else." The courthouse was a stark contrast to the quiet of Ethan's home. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing as Ethan stepped out of his car. He kept his head down, guiding Max carefully through the crowd. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Randy Briggs sat at the defense table, his expression a mix of anger and defiance. His gang members flanked him, their postures stiff and unyielding. Ethan took his place on the witness stand, his resolve steady. When called upon, he recounted the events that led to Max's poisoning, the threats left at his home, and the escalating harassment of the community. "Max is more than just a pet," Ethan said, his voice firm but emotional. "He's family. And what they did to him wasn't just cruel. It was a message to everyone who stood up to them. We can't let that kind of fear win." Randy's lawyer attempted to undermine Ethan's testimony, but the evidence was damning. The toxic substances found during the search, the surveillance footage of Randy's transactions, and the testimonies from other community members painted a clear picture of the gang's actions. As the trial progressed, more witnesses came forward, including Mara and other local business owners. Their accounts detailed years of intimidation and fear, bolstering the case against Randy and his gang. Finally, the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Randy and his gang were sentenced to prison, their reign of terror in Glendale brought to an end. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Justice had been served. That evening, Ethan returned home with Max by his side. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, safer. As they walked through the familiar streets, neighbors stopped to greet them, offering smiles and words of gratitude. "You stood up for all of us," Mara said when they passed the cafe. "Thank you, Ethan." "I didn't do it alone," Ethan replied. "This community deserves the credit. We all stood up together." Later, as Ethan settled onto his porch with Max curled up beside him, he reflected on everything they had endured. The past weeks had been some of the most challenging of his life, but they had also shown him the strength of the bond he shared with Max and the power of standing up for what was right. Max let out a contented sigh, resting his head on Ethan's lap. Ethan smiled, stroking the dog's fur. "We did it, buddy," he said softly. "We made it through." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. Justice had been served, and Glendale was safer for it. But most importantly, Max was home, and that made all the difference. The soft light of dawn bathed Glendale in hues of gold and pink, the town slowly waking to the sound of chirping birds and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Ethan Carter sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands. Beside him, Max lay sprawled on the wooden floorboards, his tail lazily swishing back and forth. The Labrador mix, now fully recovered, seemed to embody the calm and peace that had finally returned to their lives. Ethan glanced down at his loyal companion, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're enjoying this quiet, aren't you, buddy?" he said. Max let out a soft huff, his expressive eyes glancing up at Ethan before closing again. It had been 3 weeks since the trial that had seen Randy Briggs and his gang brought to justice. The neighborhood had changed in that short time, the air no longer tinged with the tension and fear that had gripped it for so long. The cafe was bustling again. Local businesses were thriving, and neighbors walked their dogs with newfound confidence. For Ethan, the days since the trial had been a whirlwind of activity and reflection. He'd received countless messages of gratitude and support, both from the Glendale community and beyond. Local news outlets had dubbed him a hero, a title he was hesitant to embrace. He didn't feel like a hero. He had simply done what needed to be done. As the morning wore on, Ethan decided to take Max for a walk through the neighborhood. The leash clipped securely to Max's collar, they set off down the familiar streets. The first stop was the cafe, where Mara was busy arranging flowers on the patio. She looked up as they approached, her face lighting up with a smile. "Well, if it isn't the town's most famous duo," she teased, wiping her hands on her apron. Ethan laughed. "We're just trying to blend in, Mara. How's business?" "Better than ever," she replied. "It's amazing what a little peace of mind can do. People actually enjoy sitting outside again." Max wagged his tail enthusiastically as Mara crouched down to scratch behind his ears. "Good to see you looking so happy, Max," she said. "You've got quite the fan club here, you know? People keep asking about you." Ethan chuckled. He deserves the attention. He's the real star. They chatted for a while longer before continuing their walk. As they strolled past other local businesses, Ethan couldn't help but notice the changes. A hardware store owner who had once hesitated to invest in repairs now had a shiny new sign above his shop. Families gathered at the park, children laughing as they played without a care. The transformation was subtle but profound. The walk eventually led them to a part of town Ethan hadn't visited in years, the edge of a small wooded area that bordered Glendale. Max tugged at the leash, his excitement clear as his nose sniffed the air. All right, Ethan said with a laugh. "Let's see what's so interesting." They followed a narrow dirt path that wound through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The air was cooler here, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. Max bounded ahead, his tail wagging furiously. Ethan felt a sense of calm settle over him as they walked. The events of the past few months felt distant here, as if the forest were a sanctuary untouched by the chaos of the world. He found himself reflecting on everything that had happened, not just the fight for justice, but the connections he'd forged along the way. As the day progressed, Ethan returned home with Max, his mind buzzing with ideas. He had been receiving offers from local organizations and even national animal rights groups, all wanting him to speak or collaborate on campaigns. While he appreciated the recognition, he hadn't decided how to move forward. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk, sifting through emails and messages. One stood out, a letter from a nearby rescue organization seeking volunteers to help with community outreach and education. Max patted over, resting his head on Ethan's lap. "What do you think, buddy?" Ethan asked, stroking Max's fur. "Time to give back?" Max let out a soft bark, as if in agreement. Ethan smiled. "All right, let's do it." In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Max became fixtures at community events. They visited schools to teach kids about responsible pet ownership, helped organize adoption drives, and worked with local shelters to improve conditions for animals in need. One particularly memorable day saw Ethan and Max at a large adoption fair hosted in the town square. The event was a lively affair, with booths offering everything from pet supplies to training tips. Families wandered through, children squealing with delight as they met puppies and kittens. Max, wearing a vest that read Ambassador, was the star of the show. He greeted everyone with his signature wag and gentle demeanor, melting hearts wherever he went. Ethan watched with pride as Max interacted with a group of children. "He's come a long way," he said to Mara, who had joined him for the event. "So have you," she replied. As the months passed, Ethan found himself settling into this new chapter of his life. The offers from Hollywood still came, but he no longer felt the pull to return to the chaos of the industry. Glendale had become his home in every sense of the word, a place where he could make a real difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on his porch with Max at his feet. The neighborhood was quiet, the air filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant murmur of voices. Ethan looked down at Max, his hand resting on the dog's head. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Max's tail thumped against the porch, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a look of pure contentment. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had brought him to a place of peace and purpose. Together, he and Max had not only survived, they had thrived. And their story was far from over.